Militias and Democratization in Southeast Asia. What role do militias play in democratization? In most of the literature on Southeast Asia and democratization movements in Southeast Asia, I think there has been a tendency to create a bifurcated picture between democratic and anti-democratic forces. In other words, this notion that anti-democratic forces are by and large and by their very nature against the people, anti-people power, elitist, very narrowly focused. When in actual fact, when you look at processes of democratization in places like Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, when democratic transitions occur, when authoritarian, narrow regimes fall, there is actually a democratization of violence by illiberal elements within that society. In other words, they militarize the masses, they militarize subaltern elements, largely through the formation of militias. And that is something that does need to be given more attention in the literature. Militias and the democratization of Thailand. In Thailand in the 1950s and 60s, what you had was a very narrow and oppressive set of military regimes. The form that military government took consolidated itself largely under the rule of Saritanarat, basically from 1957 until 1963, and then under his successors, Prapas Charasatien and Thanom Kitkachon. These military rulers tended to rely on brute force, weaponry provided by the United States as a part of Thailand's involvement in the Second Indochina War, being deployed using this American weaponry, redirecting it in a sense against indigenous communist insurgents. They did embrace a kind of, showcase or show democracy in 1968, which was then followed by an auto coup in 1971, where the masses were meant to be more spectators held in awe of the state rather than active participants in the state's efforts. This, of course, led to the People Power Uprising in October 1973 that toppled the regime. And initially, the royalist establishment, the burgeoning royalist elites, were all for this transition. They allowed the masses to rebel. They supported the masses. But as the democratic governments of 1973 to 1976 became more radical, certainly I think by 1975 it's very clear, with the Indochina Revolution, the collapse of South Vietnam, the abolition of the Cambodian and Lao monarchies in 1975, the Thai monarchy became very afraid. But rather than, interestingly enough, rather than retreating into a more narrow and elitist venue, the monarchy reached out to the people, largely through the Border Patrol Police, a kind of paramilitary police force in Thailand, and used this police organization to found an institution called the Village Scouts, or a militia organization called the Village Scouts, which very, very quickly, of course, the Village Scouts were actually founded in the early 1970s, but they quickly came under royal patronage, and during this 73 to 76 period, they exponentially expanded to the extent that by 1976, there were 2 million members within this Village Scout movement. And of course, the Village Scouts were very prominently involved in the massacre at Thammasat University on October 6, 1976. Now, very recent work by Thongchai Winichakun, who probably knows more about the massacre at Thammasat in 76 than any other person, has shown that the people involved in most gruesome acts of violence, the desecration of corpses and so on, were not actually village scouts as such. They were not even probably Red Gores, another militia organization founded at that time in the mid-1970s. That's when they came to the preeminence. They were actually a smaller group of trained vigilantes, trained by Thai security intelligence, that committed the most gruesome acts. However, I think we can conclusively say that the spectacle of violence was beheld by the village scouts at Thammasat and other scout organizations across the country who heard about the killing shortly thereafter, and they reveled and relished in the killings that took place. So even though they weren't maybe directly involved in the most heinous and violent actions on that day, they certainly approved of those actions. Interestingly enough, in 1977, during the Kriangsak coup against the Tanin government, the Kriangsak faction was anti-village scout. It did not like the notion of a militiaed royalist regime that was making all kinds of demands in addition to fighting communism, and gradually the village scout movement begins to decline. The army starts to support other militia groups, largely in Thai villages. These are sort of auxiliary counterinsurgency forces. You see the foundation of the Thai Rangers, which is a more paramilitary, more regular, I think, military force. It's not so much a rabble as it is an arm, a rural extension of the Thai armed forces. And these movements do play a contributing factor in containing the communist insurgency in the 1970s and 80s. When democracy returns in a more lasting fashion to Thailand, certainly say by the 1990s, and through that period into the Thaksin era, you see the emergence of the Yellow Shirt movement, which is also a kind of mass royalist paramilitary militia of sorts, not as direct, not as sort of blatant as other militia organizations, but there is a kind of, if we can invent the term, massification or distribution of royalism downward across wide swathes of the society. And the Yellow Shirts are quite eclectic. They are composed of Thai intellectual elites, ordinary people from the Bangkok Thonburi urban agglomeration, all people that are inducted into an organization or series of organizations that are subaltern in many respects, all counterinsurgents in all respects. They are a counterinsurgency force or an anti-populist force directed against royalism. So rather than using brute military force, very narrow repression based on weaponry, as was the case of under Thanom and Prapas, you have a royalist establishment that incorporates and inducts the population into illiberal mass movements, all in the name of defending, ironically enough, a royalist democracy. Militias in Indonesia during Suharto and after. In Indonesia, what's very interesting is that in the 1940s and 50s, you have the emergence of a mass society and a whole slew of militia organizations. Some of them are Islamist, some of them are communist, some of them are more secular nationalist. Very recent work on this subject has shown, I think very definitively, that the mass killings which took place in 1965-66 were certainly mainly done by militia units, but militia units working very, very closely with the most right-wing, most, well, if you like, pathologically anti-communist elements of the Indonesian army at that time. So there is a kind of weaponization of pre-existing mass organizations by elements of the Indonesian army around Suharto, who are loyal primarily to Suharto, and the use of these mass movements, largely again made up of subalterns, although their leadership certainly had a number of elites in them, that conducted most of the mass killing. During the Orde Baru, the New Order regime, Suharto and company demilitarize, or shall we say, deactivate a number of these militia organizations, especially the NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, and try and conduct things more in the vein of a kind of bureaucratic patrimonial state. It is not a mass-based, it is not a state that relies heavily on mass movements. However, interestingly enough, when one is looking at the counterinsurgency campaigns conducted by the Indonesian state at this time, in places like West Papua, East Timor, and in a later period in Aceh, they deploy methods, practices, precedents, and types of militias that were earlier seen in the core of the Indonesian state are now replicated on the peripheries of the Indonesian state. So again, in Papua, in Aceh, and in Timor, most certainly, you have the use of paramilitary organizations, the militarization of subaltern elements, all making it look like there is a mass base of support for Indonesian occupation or Indonesian policies in these places, when in actual fact they are basically auxiliaries and arms of the state within these localities. But again, it's to complicate the picture further, the Indonesians were generally very good at playing on rivalries, factions, different clans, different tribes that in these places that had mutual animosities. The Indonesians enter the scene and aggravate and further militarize and further widen these animosities to the extent that they can rely on auxiliaries from these localities taking part in certain actions against insurgents. In 1998, of course, you have Reformasi, and from 1998 to about 2004, you have widespread political instability in Indonesia at this time, and a need to conduct politics through militias. So you have Laskar Jihad, certainly in the Malucan Islands. You have various Timorese militias that try to upset the transition to post-Indonesian rule in East Timor, and you have Achenese militias running rampant basically until the time of the 2004 tsunami, the December 2004 tsunami. Indonesia still has militias, but they tend not to be as, shall we say, virulent and direct, because the Indonesian state has succeeded in deactivating insurgencies in Timor and Aceh, which were aggravating societal or subaltern, if you like, militarization. During elections, you occasionally see preman, criminal elements appearing, but what militias are in existence and are very powerful, like the NU, are very much going their own way and have their own policies. They are no longer sort of a subordinated arm to the Indonesian state. Militias and democratization in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines has a very vexed and complicated relationship with militias. Initially, you do see them as an arm of the Marcos regime. By about 1976, Marcos had exponentially expanded the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and viewed them as having obtained too much power. And in order to limit this power, he rapidly expands, consolidates, coalesces the Civilian Home Defense Forces, the CHDF. These organizations are pretty much a counter to Indonesian military power, and they play a leading role in counterinsurgency operations, particularly against the NPA, the New People's Army, the Communist Army, fighting to overthrow the Marcos regime and found a more peoples-oriented government. These were very rowdy elements, violent and unruly, and they were responsible for a number of the disappearances and torture and murder, the salvagings, as they were called, during the Marcos era, especially during the 1980s in particular. They did work hand in hand with the AFP in certain sectors and in certain places. The AFP itself founds its own militias on certain fronts, but they're generally seen as a rival. What happens with people power, interestingly enough, in 1986, is that the AFP consolidates its control over militias and paramilitary organizations, making them an arm of the Philippine security establishment. Now again, we cannot just attribute the growth of these militias to nefarious influences within the Philippine military or security establishment. There was also a tremendous amount of economic dislocation in the 1980s, a need for people to obtain some livelihood or some resources somewhere, somehow. So it's very easy for the army to pull in subaltern elements into its security apparatus. Also, the NPA is not entirely free of guilt here. Factional rivalries within the communist movement led to a number of extrajudicial killings, executions, show trials, and whatnot. This led to rivalries and resentments, and the AFP could flip. Of course, the AFP and other intelligence units in the Philippine state did all they could to aggravate and encourage these rivalries, but nevertheless, they came in and flipped disgruntled elements within the NPA and made them into militia members. Indeed, many militiamen in the Alsamasa, the Masses Arise movement in Davao City, were part of the NPA at one point or another in their lives before they joined Alsamasa in the second half of the 1980s. So in a way, there is a kind of fragmentation of people's power, a taming of people's power, perhaps, but I think it's more accurate to say a fragmentation and turning against each other of leftist radical elements, which allows the Philippine state to assert its dominance over society and substantially contain leftist currents. It isn't premised on sheer brute state coercion alone, although that certainly plays a role. It is a state coercion that is very much embedded in society, outsourcing counterinsurgency and outsourcing repression. This has a tremendous amount of importance for present-day developments, of course, because the Duterte regime, interestingly enough, it's a very eclectic, oppressive regime that takes methods and tactics from the NPA, this sort of riding in tandem assassination thing. It was notorious. The NPA was notorious for this. People driving in on scooters, one of them hopping off, shooting someone, jumping back on, and then scooting away. This happened in Davao City all throughout the 1980s, and Duterte is using this NPA methodology. He himself had a previous sympathy for the NPA, which has now pretty much fully dissipated. But you also see, because of the rise of social media, because of the rise of Facebook and various other platforms, you also see, I think, interestingly, a militiafication or a spreading of militia rhetoric, militia symbols, militia language into the cybersphere. Unfortunately, it seems that the Duterte regime has a dominant voice in cyberspace. Unlike the network monarchy in Thailand, where it seems anti-monarchist and anti-state elements, youth groups and things like this, seem to be dominating Thai cyberspace. Philippine cyberspace is very much more dominated by Duterte regime loyalists, cyber trolls, and so on and so forth. However, regardless of this rhetorical similarity, one wonders really how deeply this phenomenon has percolated the society. Because as we know, it's perfectly possible to set up phantom accounts and things like this. So it's very hard to see how much of a mass organization this really is. It's very, very loud. And there are a lot of numbers on computer screens that we can see. But how genuine these numbers are, one really does not know enough at this time to definitively say. It's something that I think merits much further research. Also, these elements, these cyber trolls and Duterte supporters on the internet are not very good at turning out at mass rallies and turning away or intimidating or brutalizing anti-Duterte elements. Those sorts of activities are left to the traditional death squads, policemen working undercover, deep penetration units, and things like this. Why study militias? I think in Southeast Asia today, there is a tremendous need for democratization, but it must be a civil democratization, not a militarized democratization. If genuine democracy is to take hold in Southeast Asia, it must be democracy without militias.